Happy Charter Day, Miami alumni and friends. I'm Mark Masechko, Associate Executive Director of the Miami University Alumni Association. And I think we're in for a really exciting Charter Day celebration, talking about, in my opinion, a really fun topic, bourbon. So welcome to the final Winter College 2025 webinar, The Best American Whiskeys to Try in 2025 with Phil Kollin and Dr. Mike Crowder. Before we get started, I'd like to say a special thank you to our sponsors for Winter College, the Knolls of Oxford. We appreciate their partnership and our partnership with the Knolls and their sponsorship, which helps us bring this type of programming to all of you. We have an amazing crowd watching all over the country and the world, including a little over 150 alumni spanning the classes of 1958 all the way up to the class of 2024. So those of you who are watching live, feel free to submit your questions and comments through the webinar by clicking on the Ask a Question button under your video. So with that, I'd like to introduce our hosts for the evening. Phil Kollin graduated from Miami in 2000 and is host of Unique and Custom Whiskey Adventures. He's an executive bourbon steward, a certified tourism ambassador, and is also the founder of Phil Talks Whiskey. Pretty safe to say that Phil knows his bourbon. Mike Crowder is the Associate Provost and Dean of the Graduate School and a professor here at Miami. He's also an Executive Bourbon Steward. Mike's Crowder Laboratory analyzes distilled spirits to develop a library of chemical fingerprints for authentication. Boy, it's I haven't even had a drink yet. Purposes and to map the chemical content of bourbons with consumer preferences. So I would say we're in some pretty good bourbon hands tonight. So Phil and Mike, thank you both for joining us this evening, and let's talk and taste bourbon.
Thanks, excellent. Mark, thank you so much. What a tremendous introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be back leading another whiskey tasting and presentation with Miami University and my university alumni. A little bit it covered quite well, but once again, I run a small bourbon adventure company called Phil Talks Whiskey, which is exactly what I do. I talk all sorts of bourbon, all sorts of whiskey, from treehouse to clubhouse to boardroom to outhouse, whatever gives me a chance to talk about America's native spirit and to share some of the great history and lore, the business side of it, the tasting, all of it. It's a real pleasure to do it. I've done a few of these for Miami University, virtually online, and I've done a couple live, and there's always new things to explore, new challenges, and new just bourbons to share. So I'm always excited. And I keep holding out hope, keep hope alive that one day basketball great and fellow classmate Wally Zerbiak shows up in here. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Wally Ball is going to submit a question sometime during our taste. And of course, great way to end President's Weekend. And I've been looking forward to this all weekend because it means a Monday night where I get to sip bourbon, and any Monday where I get to sip whiskey is a really great day. So yeah, basically, I've been doing this for a number of years. I've been up and down the Bourbon Trail, hosting groups, touring distilleries, tastings, presentations, educations, you name it. And it's been a pleasure to become an Executive Bourbon Steward, which gives you kind of an in-depth knowledge of all things whiskey and getting your hands on all the news you can. You can follow me on Instagram at Derby City Phil. I'm also on X or Twitter, wherever we're calling it, at City Phil. And most importantly, you can send me an email with questions. When I do these, every time I do these like clockwork, like 3 days later in the middle of the night, someone will have a burning question about something I said or something they want to know about whiskey. So feel free to drop me a line whenever, phil@philtalkswhiskey.com. Last but not least, these are always fun because everyone's tasting at home. We're all in this together. And the only downside is I don't get to see you guys. I only get to look back at my ugly mug all night. So I invite you to share pictures of your own tasting setup. Let me see what you're drinking. Feel free to send any pictures my way on social media or email me, once again, at philtalkswhiskey.com. I'm told we have a big online crowd tonight, so we're going to pepper in questions that we got in advance that the Miami alumni have submitted, either leading up to this presentation or as we get them tonight. So it's always inquisitive, smart, really intriguing questions that are great dropping off points to talk more about whiskey. So if you have a question, you can use the chat function to drop in what you want to know. And then we've got the crack team at the Alumni Association checking out the questions, and they'll feed them to us as we go. This is never designed to be a monologue. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what you should taste. how you should enjoy your whiskey. No, this is a dialogue. I want to hear from you guys. Remember, the favorite whiskey in the world, the best whiskey in the world is whatever you like the most. No one should tell you how to drink it or what you should like. It should be something for everyone. And so these are always designed to be engaging and interactive. So that's the main thing to do. And I promise you, because I've learned my lesson, I will not keep you too long from drinking. Never keep a thirsty room of 100 plus people from getting the whiskey. So we'll get to it fairly quickly. Tonight, as we go through the drinks, there's only one strong suggestion. No rules in the world of bourbon whiskey. Just one very strong suggestion, and that's sip when Mike and I sip. We're going to lead you through the tasting, and I think you'll enjoy it more as we go progressively down each one. So drink when we drink. Otherwise, you can look at the bottles. You can hold the bottle. You can hold them lovingly. You can adore. You can anticipate, but taste when we taste. Tonight's tasting. What are we doing? What's this all about? What have you stumbled into? Well, we came up with an idea to kind of take this in a direction we haven't done, and I do this just about every year in one capacity or another for one tasting or another. And this is the best American whiskeys to try in 2025. And as luck would have it, they're all Kentucky bourbons. Every product we're going to try tonight is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey that was distilled, aged, and bottled in the state of Kentucky, the home of bourbon, of course. But of course, as you know, if you've been to any of our presentations before, bourbon can be made anywhere in America and still be called bourbon as long as it follows the rules. But still, the vast majority of them is being made in Kentucky. Now, when I say the best American whiskeys to try in 2025, I'm not talking about the $400 bottle that sits on a shelf that is available for 17 people on the third day in May. No, these are designed to be that you could find, mostly speaking, on any well-stocked liquor store shelf in America. None of these cross that triple price range of $100 or more. And these are permanent extensions. These are bottles that are going to be with us for a long time. These aren't limited offerings or one-time expressions. Now, I like to put on the opinion sombrero. I like to be wear it on my sleeve about how I feel about bottles. And I often joke that I'm Whiskey Switzerland. I don't represent a specific brand. I don't have a vested interest in who buys what. I'm friend to all, but loyal to none. So we're going to try these. And if you hate them, that's a you problem, not a me problem. I want you to explore, and hopefully you discover a new favorite. These are brands I really like. I'm excited to share. But if they're not for you, that's A-okay. You put it in the back of your cupboard. When a friend comes over that you don't like as much, that's what this bottle goes for. But I think we've got really 3 great pours today. So here's how tonight's going to go. We've got 3 bottles where there's a method to the madness. We're going to drink them in a semblance of order. We're going to start with the Jim Beam Black, which is aged 7 years. We're going to go then from there to the Green River Kentucky Straight Wheated Bourbon. Hopefully, if you got these bottles, they look similar to yours. If you don't have these, you can drink whatever, and we can pretend. There's all the great stuff to have. And then we're going to end with the Bardstown Bourbon Company's release Origins series. When you do a tasting at home, and I've said this before, you usually want to taste low proof to high proof. You usually want to start out with something that's closer to that 80 to 90 range. And if you have anything that's cask strength or barrel strength, you want to end with that. Tonight, all are in about that 90 to 95 range, so that's less of an issue. Also, when I like to do these, I like to kind of share bourbon news because there's always something exciting happening in the world of whiskey. It keeps me on the toes. There's never a dull moment. And there was news about the Whistle Pig Distillery that's out of Vermont. If you did this tasting with us last year around Charter Day, we had news about, we had a Whiskey Pig rye that was on the tasting lineup. And Whiskey Pig is making a lot of news recently. They're actually setting up shop in Louisville. They'll be down at an old billiard spot almost 2 blocks from Whiskey Row. And that's kind of a big deal because there's a lot of distillery experiences in Louisville. But this is the first time that like a non-Kentucky distillery, a company based way in Vermont, who's famous for their rye, is kind of getting on the action. I live in Louisville. This is my office. I'm here in Louisville, so it's going to be really exciting to see them open up, which is supposed to be later this summer, with a multi-million-dollar refit of this billiards building and turn new experience. But what caught my ear is somewhere in the announcement of the distillery, they're going to have a new product, which is called Snout to Tail. Snout to Tail. Everything with Whistle Pig is a bovine joke. No, that's a cow. Is a pig joke. Porcine joke. Thank you. I had the top of my head. So they've got a new product called Snout to Tail, which employs what they're calling a flipping method. And it's a process which is going to take their barrels and flip them 180 degrees in the warehouse. Bear with me, folks. It's going to flip it 180 degrees in the warehouse to capture Each barrel head's unique toasted flavors. They have 2 distinct barrel heads. And it's important to note, with the way Whistle Pig and many distillers store their barrels, it's not the traditional ricking like you see when you tour where they're on their side, but they're palletized. So what they're saying is they're going to take this and turn it on its head, all for the quest to make a better bourbon by doing snout to tail and rotating the barrels 180 degrees. So you got to ask yourself, in this age when everyone's got an angle and everyone's got a gimmick, is this really a process, certainly new, no one else is doing it, is this really a process that's going to create a better bourbon, or is all just marketing hogwash, for lack of a better word? I've got an opinion, but I want to turn it over to our resident chemist who can give us some scientific evidence, and I want to hear what Mike has to say about this. Mike, my good friend, please.
Yeah,
share us your whiskey takes. Put on your own opinion sombrero this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And so the rotation of barrels has gone on for almost over 100 years, and it's for the exact reason that he said. In fact, it could be argued that the whole reason that Jefferson's puts their barrels on ships is so the liquid can come in contact with the entire barrel as the ship is rocking on the waves and everything. I believe it's probably a marketing gimmick, to tell you the truth, because during the summer when the distillate inside that barrel starts to heat up, it's going to definitely come in contact with the top of the barrel itself. And so I suspect that I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that after they've dropped 4 or 5 of these barrels and they shatter when they fall on the ground, they're going to probably move to a different marketing gimmick, but I might be wrong about that. So
my take is I just don't know how much interaction there is with the liquid and the top and the bottom of the barrel. You always hear about the staves doing the hard work, but more importantly, it's a product that's aged 10 years. It's $90. I don't know. Proof will be in the pudding. I'll give it a try. I always say it like this: I'd like to taste your 10-year product that's $90 in a barrel that wasn't rotated and one that was, and see if I could taste the difference. So I'm a bit skeptical, but we'll see. I'll hold out hope until I taste it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that so much variability is in every single barrel. You would probably have to sample about 100 of each type to really come to a full conclusion. But I mean, that might be something we need to do for science, you know.
For science.
Yeah.
The things I do for science.
I know. So.
One of the questions we got leading in tonight that I thought was an excellent question that I wanted to kick off our tasting address is Ben Morgan threw out a wonderful question before tonight. And he said, is there truly a supply issue in bourbon or whiskey for some distilleries, or does intentional scarcity for some premium products? And the answer is yes, to both. On the short answer for is there really a supply issue? Yeah, small distilleries are struggling in some cases to make sure their product is aged and keep it out and bottle and keep it on the shelf. Even larger distilleries who are trying to get their products in all 50 states. Buffalo Trace comes to mind, their everyday Buffalo Trace. They have trouble. They're working on it. They're building new warehouses at a lightning fast pace. They've doubled their production capacity, but keeping up with demand and even the general products for large and small distilleries continues to be an issue. As far as intentional scarcity, that's definitely deliberate, especially with these smaller one-off bottles they're putting out at $200, $250. They are expensive to age. You pay a barrel tax. You have evaporation. So they're expensive to bottle. They're expensive to sell. And they really want to make enough to satisfy demand while still keeping you thirsty for a little bit more. Keep the interest high, but make sure these $200 bottles aren't collecting dust on the shelf. The more people want it, there's one thing I've learned in whiskey. It's the more people want it, the harder it is to get it. So it's rarely a brand's driving marketing strategy or production strategy with across the line, but most distilleries have a couple products where they do limited releases on purpose to kind of increase intentional scarcity. Old Forester Birthday Bourbon is a great example. They have more warehouses than I can count, but they're very limited with how many bottles they put out every year on September 2nd for Old Forester Birthday Bourbon. And that's done on purpose to create demand and to get people excited for it. So the answer is yes, there is supply issues, and there's also from time to time intentional scarcity. All right, who's ready to drink? This guy.
Yes.
Mike, you ready?
Let's go.
Mark's going to join us on this one too. We're starting our first pour with Jim Beam Black. This is aged 7 years. It's out of Claremont, Kentucky, although it could be out of their sister distillery down the road in Boston, Kentucky. Owned by Centauri Brands, aged every bit of 7 years, has that big 7 on the label, and bottled at 90 proof. First and foremost, I love shattering some bourbon myths. One bourbon myth I often shatter is never, ever judge a bottle by its top. This guy is a screw top. But just because it's not a cork, just because it doesn't have a cannon, just because it doesn't have a guy riding a horse in the Derby, doesn't mean you should judge it. Judge it on its pour. So we're going to give us a little pour. We'll just eyeball it here. And then we're going to, the first thing we got to do, if you remember, before we taste any whiskey, is give it a good nose. Get in there, maybe an inch or two below the nose, back and forth. This really helps prepare your palate for the whiskey you're about to receive, especially if this is your first pour of the day. And then try it again with your mouth really open. Try taking the tip of your tongue and putting it to the top of your mouth and taking a deep inhale. And with all these, we're going to have a sip, and we're second sip, and then we're going to talk about it. So love and honor. Here's the Miami. Cheers.
Cheers.
Try to coat the palate, do what they call the Kentucky chew. Make sure every sensory nerve is exposed to the bourbon. First sip's going to be that chalk, and then we go back for a little second sip, but we can enjoy a little more. I brought a prop. Do you guys want to see the prop I brought? It's not the whiskey. The whiskey's not a prop. Jim Beam has had an interesting history, a long history, probably no name more associated with bourbon than Jim Beam brands. And they put out different age expressions for a while. This isn't that long ago. This was about 8 or 9 years ago. They did a whole signature craft series. And it's a dusty, truly, because it's been sitting on my cabinet gathering dust. But I'm going to open it one day soon. I'm maybe around Derby time this year. But what's unique about this is it's a 12-year Jim Beam product. Jim Beam White Label, one of the best-selling bourbons in the world, is aged 4 years, probably not much longer. And you don't see many Jim Beam products aged as long as 12 years, although you're adding more and more. When this came out, it was only about a $50 bottle, but the whole signature craft line that had things like rolled oats as a flavor grain, different expressions, didn't last very long. But this was a great one I picked up, and I can't wait to see what a 12-year Jim Beam tastes like. The reason I bring that up is that this has had its own journey recently. This version of Jim Beam Black is relatively new to the market. It just was made a permanent extension this past June. And the history of Jim Beam Black goes back to 1978 when they started calling it double-aged. And that meant it was aged 8 years, twice as long as regular Jim Beam White Label, and sold at a premium price. The proof was also a little bit higher. It was then, it is now. This is 90 proof. Regular Jim Beam is 80 proof, which, as you may know, is the bare minimum proof you can bottle your bourbon and still call it bourbon as required by law. Then the number bounced around a little bit. They took that 8 right off, and they went from calling it double-aged to extra-aged. Ambiguous, meaningless. Speculation was that it was aged about 6 years, maybe 6.5. And then as inventory grew, because Jim Beam has well over 100 warehouses, each one holding well over 25,000 barrels for a total of well over 1.2 million barrels across the state, they made a big deal where they were putting the age statement back on here and saying age 7 years. So you're probably thinking to yourself, what's the big deal between an 8-year bourbon and a 7-year bourbon and a 6.5-year bourbon? A lot. 1 year can make a significant difference, but more importantly is the scale of it. How many of these sell in, how many they're barreling, how many they take to the cistern room and dump. So they're very cautious about age statements they put on the bottle and if they can continue to fulfill that. I'm going to have another sip. I'll give myself a quick break here. I like this one a lot. My only complaint with this one is I wish it was higher proof. I'd love to see a Jim Beam expression from that everyday Jim Beam mash bill recipe come in not only at 7 years, but 95 proof, 100, 105 proof. It's only a bit higher than regular Jim Beam, but it's a really good sipper. And most importantly, and I never really like to talk about bourbons without considering how much you're going to pay for it. When someone tells me a bourbon's great, but it's $750, I say, well, that's great. I'll buy 18 bottles of Russell's Reserve 10-year instead. So the price of admission on this one is wonderful. It's not that much more than Jim Beam White Label, and it really holds its own. So I'm a big fan of having Jim Beam Black with that big 7-year label back on here and a product from Jim Beam. So cheers to our first pour of the night. And to James Beauregard Beam, born in 1865, and the bourbon that carries his name all these years later today. Jim Beam Distillery down in Claremont just a couple years ago finished a major renovation. It's beautiful. They've got a great restaurant. If you've not taken the tour, go hang out. Statues of Booker No, statues of Jim Beam, worth the photo opportunities around. Now, we talk about age, and a popular saying down at Buffalo Trace is that when it comes to aging whiskey, you can't cheat Mother Nature and you can't rush Father Time. But that's only true if you don't work for the chemistry department at Miami University. And Mike has some research he's been doing on accelerating aging, including how the proof goes up or down in some of the barrels they've been working on. And I want to hear more about that from Mike.
All right, thanks, Phil. And first of all, this is a fantastic starting pour. I can't
Thank you.
believe the finish on a 90 proof bourbon.
I know.
And oh my gosh, what a cinnamon blast this is. This is awesome. So thank you for this one and the stories about it. So I did want to share some information with you guys. It's kind of an update, but we've gotten a lot done over the last, I don't know, maybe year than when we did this before. And I put together a few slides. I promise this won't be a chemistry lecture, but there are some things I wanted to show you real quickly. So can we move to the next slide, please? So just some quick tidbits about aging in a barrel. So over on the left side of this, it shows barrel aging, and three major things happen in a barrel when it ages. One is that the alcohol changes in almost every barrel. And so if you go on a distillery tour, almost always they will tell you is that the proof goes up during the aging process. And they argue it's because water is smaller chemical than ethanol. Well, a couple of things. Barrels vary depending on the barrel. And second of all, clearly they didn't take general chemistry at Miami because water forms networks with other water molecules and is actually inside that barrel much bigger than an ethanol molecule. A second thing that happens is that the color changes, and this happens pretty quickly. Probably 6 months into the aging, it's already starting to turn that beautiful bourbon color. And then oxygen chemistry occurs. And so during the barrel aging process, actually the volume inside that barrel changes. It actually goes down over time. Anywhere from 3 to 10% of the barrel is lost every single year. And so, and this loss is called the angel share. The angels love bourbon just like we do, and they want their share. And so this little picture here shows you what a barrel would look like when it's new filled, 10 years, 15 years, and 23 years.
And Mike, just to interject real fast, all the time, one question I get on the Bourbon Trail is that if products that are aged longer, for example, Pappy Van Winkle, 23 years old, are so popular, why don't they just make more of it? And that bottom right image of how little the return is and how long you have to wait. And I think 17 gallons is optimistic. I've heard numbers far less than that.
Yeah, and so with that too, sometimes they actually open up the barrel and there's nothing in it. And just think about this. These distillers have been paying taxes on a full barrel. That's a law that's going to be changed, I think, or it was just changed in Kentucky. And so that turns out better for the distillers. And so this aging process takes time. And as Phil pointed out, Buffalo Trace talks about that this aging process can't be sped up, but it does. And so there's several strategies that different distillers use to fast age bourbon. One of them, and there's several distillers to do this, one of which is Cleveland Whiskey up in Cleveland, Ohio, is that they will take brand new distillate, put it into a container, add charred wood chips, and then increase the pressure and then release it. And what they're trying to mimic is during the summer when that distillate gets really, really hot, it starts to expand into the wood. And then when you release the pressure, like during the winter time, it goes back into the barrel itself, going through that important char layer that actually filters some of the chemicals out of the distillate as it moves back and forth. So a couple of places have started to bubble oxygen through it, knowing how important that oxygen chemistry is inside the barrel. What we actually chose was a small barrel approach, and I'm going to show you what we did with that. And that increases the surface area that the distillate can actually touch that barrel during the aging process. Rotating barrels, and so these are barrels that you move around so they don't sit in one place the whole time. You have to be careful because some of the barrels start to fall apart after a while, and you end up with a floor full of a 10-year-old bourbon that you have to mop up. And also your customers get to smell when they walk through the rickhouse, which is pretty cool. And then steam heating the rickhouse is trying to get more and more of that summertime going into the wood and then turning the steam off. And there's a couple of the rick houses at Buffalo Trace that are steam heated that do that as well. Okay, and so our experiment, what we did is that at the time when we started this, I had not gotten a liquor license, so I couldn't legally, and I did not, since I'm at Miami, distill our own liquor. And so we were lucky that MGP gave us some of their distillate, and we used 1 gallon barrels. They were actually 1.2 gallon barrels. And we actually took that distillate and did a barrel entry of 100 proof in one barrel and 124 proof in another barrel. And then what we did is take the barrels and put it in the oven for a week. We would take a sample out, then and weigh the barrel, and then put it in the refrigerator for a week. And since this was a 1 gallon barrel, and most of the barrels that are used on the bourbon trail are 53 gallon, we said, well, that's 1 divided by 53. That's like 1 week is divided by 52 weeks in a year.
Math even I can do.
Yeah. Unfortunately, though, I'm not going to go into this, but some engineers did some calculations. We missed that time thing, but I'll show you what the results were anyway. And then we did this for 10 weeks, cycled in and out of the oven and the refrigerator. We took samples and we analyzed them with some techniques in the chemistry building at Miami. And so this shows you a picture of the two bourbons that we actually got after 10 weeks. The one with the yellow label is the barrel that we put in with 124 proof. The blue label is the one we did with 100 proof barrel entry. And we took the barrels apart, and you can see that the liquid actually absorbed right into those barrels. That dark line that's on the side of the stave right here shows you how far it went into the barrel itself.
And Mike, this was new make. This was clear whiskey when it went in. This was White Dog.
Yes,
Gosh.
It was White Dog barrel, bourbon White Dog from MGP.
And those two photos are 10 weeks.
10 weeks.
It turned the White Dog into that. That's crazy.
Yeah. And we, the barrels did lose weight over time, which is expected because of the angel share. And in fact, when we opened the ovens each week, it smelled so good in that lab because it had evaporated outside of the barrel during the time in the oven. I won't really go into the pH, but the pH did drop just like you would see in a 10-year-old bourbon. It started at a pH of 5.5, and by the time 10 weeks were over with, it was just under 4.5, which is exactly what happens inside of a barrel, a 53-gallon barrel, after about 10 years. And so just to give you some idea, we did have angel share. And so the angel share in this particular case is that we only recovered 2.75 liters when we put in 5 liters. But a lot of that bourbon was still stuck in the staves. That's called the devil's cut. And actually, Jim Beam used one of their marketings as the devil's cut in one of their bourbon brands not too long ago. And so let me quickly show you some of the data that we got. So we analyzed each one of those samples. This is with an NMR that's in the basement of Hughes Laboratories. And here are 2 of the chemicals that are actually produced by yeast, 2-methylbutanol and 3-methylbutanol. This 3-methylbutanol is interesting because it smells like bananas. And it's a chemical that's in a lot of the Brown-Forman products. Their yeast produce tons of 3-methylbutanol because that's their flavor profile.
I know right now there's people out there who've had Old Forester or Woodford Reserve who are saying, bananas, I often get that smell or that taste when I taste one of the Brown-Forman distillate products.
Yeah, and it's because of this chemical and then a chemical that's produced from this in the barrel. And so these are not produced in the barrel, and you can see their amounts. We have the concentration of the chemical and the number of weeks, and you can see it really didn't change over those 10 weeks. 2 chemicals that did change, though, were ethyl acetate and acetone, or acetic acid. Acetic acid is vinegar, and that is produced both by the yeast and it's produced in the barrel during those oxygen reactions that I told you about. Ethyl acetate's the same way. And so we know in 10 weeks from just these 2 plots that it was enough time to do the oxygen reactions that occur in 10-year-old aged bourbons. And then one that was also, these are the chemicals, so it's syringic acid, gallic acid. This is the thing that sometimes bourbon makes your mouth dry out a little bit. It's called a tannin. And so that comes from the barrel. The vanillin tasted, boy, you can get that on the Jim Beam that we just tasted, and a whole bunch of other these come from the barrel that has been charred. And noticed in this plot, which we were very fascinated by, the orange dots are the lower proof entry point and the blue ones are the higher proof entry. So what this tells you is that if you put in your white dog at a lower proof, you extract more of the chemicals from the barrel. And so pre-prohibition, almost all distilleries would barrel their bourbons at 100. Actually, 107 was a very common proof to do it. And the reason is the distillers knew that they could pull more out of those barrels if they went with the lower proof. Nowadays, most distillers barrel at 125 proof because those barrels are really expensive. And so $500 a barrel on average. And so that's driving some of the barrel entry proof, even though the old distillers knew you could pull more out of that barrel if you went to a lower proof.
And Mike, there's a reason they stop at 125 and not much higher. Do you want to tell everyone why they don't go any higher?
Yeah, that's one of the rules of making bourbon. You cannot enter the barrel greater than 125 proof. And so, and then this last slide right here, you're not going to be tested on it, so please don't worry and don't start drinking the rest of the bourbons. But what I wanted to show you this is that with our NMR studies, we can actually determine the concentration of 17 chemicals. And these chemicals are listed here with their chemical names. And so the first column of this is the average concentration of these chemicals in 300 bourbons we've analyzed. And so just to give you one example here, 3-methylbutanol, the average in 300 bourbons is 14 millimolar. If you look at our two, we're certainly pretty close to those that have been aged for 10, 12, 15 years. And so we're in the ballpark. The one we didn't get, though, was glucose, the sugars. And notice that in the average of 300 bourbons, they're about 10 times higher than what we got in ours. And I think this has given us a clue of when the sugars start to enter the bourbon. And we've got some hypotheses on that is way too much to go into right now, because I'm beginning to get thirsty right now. So, Phil, I'm going to turn this back over to you, but the take-home message is that these small barrels are great ways for you perhaps to test different conditions, different distillates, different yeast, and in 10 weeks you can get a bourbon that is very similar to a very long-aged bourbon.
I guess the most important question is, and one on everyone's mind is, how do they both taste? How do those two offerings go down?
Well, so they're incredible. The nose on them are really, really great caramel, almost like a little bit of a burnt brown sugar taste to them. They are not sweet on the palate like this Jim Beam we just tasted. The sweet is amazing in that it's not as sweet. But and I should have mentioned too that both barrels came out higher proof. So the 124 proof came out 132 proof, and the 100 proof came out 112 proof.
In just 10 weeks.
In 10 weeks. And the reason for that is, Phil had alluded to this, what determines whether a barrel gets higher proof or lower is the relative humidity in the rick house at that space. Well, we were in air-conditioned Hughes laboratories that had controlled humidity. So we knew the proof was going to go up. We just didn't know it was going to go up that high.
Phenomenal. That's so fun. Great stuff, Mike.
Thanks.
Another question we got, Pierce Johnson submitted this before the tasting night. And once again, if there's something you want to know, there's the Ask the Question button. You can put it in, and we'll see those later on, and we'll get to some of those. Pierce wanted to know, what's the best way to keep up with new releases and with delicious, affordable bourbon? And with the rise and popularity of bourbon and this bourbon boom, there's been a huge number of also bourbon blogs, podcasts, magazines, and everything else. So there's no shortage to choose who to follow on social media, what blogs to check out. You can pretty quickly tell if they're worth their salt as far as if they know what they're talking about and if their reviews seem legitimate and if they have good writing ability. Ones I personally like, and your mileage may vary, is for news on upcoming releases and reviews. I really enjoy a site called Breaking Bourbon. I also enjoy the podcast from Bourbon Pursuit. almost all the shows on the ABV network. They're a lot of fun. They've got a Bourbon Daily and a Bourbon Show. And also it's Bourbon Night out of Lexington, Kentucky. So those are just a few. Breaking Bourbon, Bourbon Pursuit, ABV Network, and it's Bourbon Night. But there's a whole lot you can check out. Moving on to bottle number 2. Get your left hand ready with the bottle and your right hand ready with the glass. This is Green River Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, and this is their wheated bourbon. Hopefully everyone picked up the wheated bottle tonight. Out of Owensboro, Kentucky, from the Green River Distilling Company. No age statement on this one, but because of labeling, I know that it's at least 4 years. It's probably a 4 to 6 year bourbon. And this one is also 90 proof, 45% alcohol. So we're going to open up. I can't wait to talk about the bottle. I usually don't do a lot of talking about the bottle, but I love this bottle. And I switched to my rocks glass. I had some ice, but it all got kind of clumped together. But this is to show you that they're all the different vessels you can drink from. Much like the bourbon, drink it as how you please. Drink the drinking vessels you please. At home, when I'm sampling in front of my couch and with my drinking partners, who are usually the Squishmallows my 8 and 10-year-old left behind when they went to bed. Great drinking companions, the Squishmallows. I usually have it in a rocks glass with a big ice cube, but drink it however you please. We'll take a small nose. You'll find almost definitely, no matter what your whiskey palate or expertise is, that this tastes very different from the Jim Beam pour, and there's one very good reason for that. So have a nose and have a sip. Cheers to Charter Day. Mark, what do you think of that first sip?
Awesome. Oh my gosh.
Hits the tongue in a very different way than the Jim Beam does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Much smoother to me.
Yeah. It's funny because it's like I set you up on that one. So what makes this different than the Jim Beam is that bourbon is essentially just a few ingredients: corn, your flavor grain, malted barley, yeast, and water. Put them together, wave a magic wand. No, just kidding. There's a whole lot to it. But those are the 5 primary ingredients you need to make bourbon whiskey. And the flavor grain is usually rye grain, but sometimes it's wheat. And much like Maker's Mark, Larceny, Weller, Pappy Van Winkle, this uses the wheat as the flavor grain instead of the rye. And if there's one thing people often say when they taste the wheat after rye is how much smoother it is. And in some cases, sweeter. It's not due to anything added to it. It's just those notes that they have. Think of wheat bourbon as like a freshly baked loaf of wheat bread. And rye is as a rye, kind of right out of the oven of that spiced rye. Freddie Johnson, Bourbon Hall of Famer down at Buffalo Trace, likes to say that wheat is sweet and rye is robust. And that really is a good 6-word capitalization to get the difference from the two. I love this bourbon. I think this is the best new everyday $32 bourbon on the shelf that wasn't there just a couple years ago.
Yeah.
The Green River Distilling Company is what's old is new again. We'll talk about them in a second, but first I want to show off this bottle. Not a lot of bottles, because I'm a cynic, because I do this a lot, because I spend too much time in liquor stores, both professionally and personally. Not a lot of bottles get my eye, but this one does for a couple of reasons. I like the shape of it a lot. I like the information they put on the label there. It really makes it stand out with the different color labels for their different offering, including their single barrel and such like that. They brought back the tax stamp. It's a decoration. It's not particularly relevant, but they have the tax stamp like you had in old school bottles before the 1980s. They have their DSP number on here, which some distilleries like to brag. It's an old distillery. So when they started the numbering system, it goes back to DSP KY10 down there in Owensboro. And at the bottom, how cool is that? It's a horseshoe with the GR with the Green River. I think that's a really cool design. Maybe I'll make some tracks in the snow with it. Green River was the O.Z. Tyler distillery for a number of years, but they decided they wanted to make kind of a higher tier, better whiskey, and they've been cranking out this stuff for a while. The brand goes back to 1885, which is in part why they have that low DSP number. A guy named J.W. McCullough, and it's one of the 10th oldest and operating distilleries in the state of Kentucky. There's 2 distilleries in Owensboro, which is about 2.5 hours west of Louisville, right there on the Ohio River. One currently owned by Sazerac, mostly bottling, not doing a lot of distilling, but these guys are back to rare form. One of the things is Green River has an old name, and you can look up the ads, and up to Prohibition a little bit before, their ad campaign was the whiskey with no hangover, which is a dangerously close to those medicinal claims. And I would argue that that's a you choice if your whiskey has no hangover, and really Green River. But it was to speak to the purity of the brand and how they weren't blending or had inferior components, and how it was a straight bourbon whiskey, so it would give you the whiskey with no hangover. Try getting away with that today. Try putting out an ad campaign and saying this is the so-and-so that will give you a hangover. Classic. I talked about bottles, by the way. 2 other bottles to keep an eye out for that are eye-catching is True Story, which is the new release from Wes Henderson, formerly of Angel's Envy. He has a new brand. It's called True Story, and it's a opaque bottle that's either white or black. If it's the bourbon or the rye, that's a pretty good one. And also Green River. They're openly sourcing for a lot of brands, but it's not like you typically think of where there's non-disclosure agreements. It's more like a partnership. And celebrity bourbons are about as common as falling down, but there's some that are really the cream of the crop. And Dierks Bentley, the country music artist, has a new line out there that's called Whiskey Row 94. And any interview he gives, he touts his partnership with Green River and how they've been able to supply him with whiskey to make an affordable product of his own that he can put out on shelves. So this is a distillery to really keep your eye on, and this is a product to really keep your eye on. I think all the Green River expressions are great. The single barrels are more expensive, but pack a better punch. But I wanted to feature this one tonight because it's their wheated expression, and it's kind of different from what we've had before. Yeah. So I'm gonna have another sip. I think we got a question here.
The question, Phil, is the Green River tastes like Irish whiskey. Am I off? And that's from Howard.
I don't know. Are you in Ireland right now? Maybe that's why. There's certainly notes of it. What often I get sometimes on the nose or in the back of my throat that makes me think of an Irish whiskey or less likely like a Scotch whiskey is some of those malted notes or peated notes that make its way into the distilling process. So, it's all distilled from cereal grains. So it's never going to be a ludicrous comparison to say it reminds you of Irish whiskey. But sometimes some of those scents and smells that have, to Mike's point, the chemical characteristics that come over are going to remind you of Irish whiskey, even though the components in the process are pretty different. And
one thing that Phil and I both were taught when we did our certificates for Executive Bourbon Steward is what you taste and what you smell is what you taste and what you smell.
Yeah, don't let anyone ever tell you what you taste or smell is wrong, because it's your own nose. And man, you do enough of these and you get some funny out of left field, crazy tasting notes, especially since there are no 2 senses. There's no sense that conveys memories more than your sense of smell, the way it brings it back. So people have some very concise or some very concrete and expressive memories of something they had or tasted when they smell or taste a bourbon. And so you get these crazy descriptions that are very specific. It's not wrong. It's what they get out of it. So you can't do anything wrong.
Yeah, one guy at one of the bourbon tastings that I hosted, he said it smelled like his grandma's attic.
There you go.
There's no way that I could refute that because I had never been in his grandmother's attic.
You're wrong.
Yeah,
your attic smells like daffodils and lilac. You're wrong. You're out. That's what's called leading a lousy tasting.
I like that one. I think I'm more of a wheated bourbon guy.
Well, there you go.
But
is there a wheated bourbon that's at the top of your list that you enjoy?
Well, I mean, I love makers. I mean, just as a basic, I really do love makers. And I'm not sure. I mean, my all-time favorite really is just because of the taste is Blanton's, and I don't know that that's heavy on. I mean, I know and at this point, Blanton's it's impossible to find, but that to me is I love it. I mean, and I get a lot of cherry out of Blanton's. This one I got a little bit of cherry, but it definitely tastes the wheat in this one more. It's good.
I'm starting a new bourbon lineup called Flanton's, and it will have a guy riding a donkey on the label.
Hey, I like that.
It'll be available everywhere. So keep an eye out for Flanton's, and also the cease and desist letter I'm bound to get from the Sazerac company when I
probably tomorrow morning.
Yes, it's up there with my other line, Tappy Tan Tinkle, which will be hitting store shelves very soon. Yeah. All right, so the question I kind of think to myself is, what would I do if I had a small but legitimate, issued by the government still? What would I make? What would I create? And Mike is one of the few people I have ever had the pleasure of talking to who has a still, but not one that's intended or licensed for any type of commercial distilling. So I know you've had some fun recently, so I want to hear all about this still.
Yeah, and Phil talked about the DSP number that's on here. I have my own DSP number, except for its OH, and then I forget what the number is.
27,000?
Yeah, actually, it's in the 200 or 300s, I believe.
Oh.
Yeah, so not too far. Another project we've been working on is that we've been testing a small commercial still and see how it does against the real expensive stills that you see on the distillery tours. And so let me show you what we did. So here's a picture of the still. It's over on the right side. It's a Vever still. I paid $90 from Amazon for it. This was after I got my liquor license. As you know, it is against federal law and Ohio state law to distill alcohol without a license. And
Did everyone hear that? I just want to make, we'll give that a second to hang in the air.
yeah,
Okay, everyone got that. Good. It's
yeah,
important.
and you can't, especially at home, you won't get a license to do it at home in Ohio. But basically what we do is we buy our grains, we use a grain mill, we do a mashing, we do fermentation, and then run it on this small little still. So over on the right where it says Vever, that's our kettle. And then standing there just above the jars, that's our little thumper keg. And then at the very top of the picture on the left, that's our worm. This other metal pot here is really doing nothing but holding the worm on the top so we can have it sort of dripping into the jars. And then we want to do a shout out to all of those moonshiners out in the woods. So we collect our fractions in mason jars, and then we analyze with NMR, just like we did the bourbons in the last project. And so here's some data that we actually have. We collect 10 fractions off of the still. Once you pour in your, it's called distiller's bill. So beer, after you distill, after you ferment your mash, it becomes, after that fermentation, called distiller's beer. And so we pour that into the kettle and we turn on the heat. And about an hour later, we start to get drips out of the worm. And so we collected the first 100 mils into a mason jar, and then every time after that we collected 200 milliliters of it. And then what we did is we determined the proof of each one of those fractions coming off the still. And you can see the very first thing that comes off that still is really high proof, 162 proof, and then 155 in the 3 runs that we actually ran.
Of note, too high proof to be bourbon.
To be bourbon, this cannot be bourbon because the rules say you cannot distill above 160 proof. And so, although we didn't use this fraction though. And so basically what we did, you can see it goes down the longer you keep collecting fractions. And then what we did was we did the NMR on all of the fractions. And let me kind of orient you what these plots look like. So the blue line here is run number 1. The orange line is run number 2, and the gray line is run number 3. And what's over here on the y-axis is the concentration we detected in that sample 1, 2, 3, and 4 and on. The lowest boiling point chemical that we can isolate in this type of run is acetaldehyde. And Phil talked about initially people saying this isn't the bourbon that will give you a headache. This is one of the chemicals that gives you a headache. This will make you feel horrible if there's a lot of that in your bourbon. And this has the flavor of green grass. It's unbelievable in the jar itself. And so we were able to determine how much acetaldehyde and when it kind of goes away. 3-methylbutanol, that banana smelling compound, is seen in the first fraction. It's sort of in the middle fractions, and then it's still a little bit there at the end of the run. And then the furfural, which has got a higher boiling point, we can't even detect it in the early jars, but then we start to see it later when the temperature inside that kettle goes up. And so this is really important to note here, is that this first sample here is often referred to as the 4 shots. And that's, if you ever watch Moonshiners, I've mentioned that I love that show. You'll see the moonshiners throw that jar out into the woods and they say, that's where all the methanol is and all the toxins. Yeah. And
more commonly, we call that the heads, right? This is the same as the heads for commercial distilling, same thing?
Yes. And the heads are technically anything that comes off before ethanol, and the tails are anything that comes off after ethanol. And so all bourbons pick, for instance, they may take the 3rd run or the 3rd jar, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th, and mix those together. And then that's what they would put into a barrel. And that's done everywhere. One that I did want to mention to you, though, is methanol. So There's an old wives' tale that in that first 4 shots, that first jar, that's where all the methanol is. Well, that's wrong. Methanol is in every single jar at equal concentrations. We cannot separate methanol from water with a still. And so this is an old wives' tale. And please don't worry, because the amount of methanol in a bottle of bourbon is so small. In order to get to the toxic levels determined by NIH, you would have to drink 47 fifths in one sitting. And the ethanol will kill you well before the methanol does.
Hey, who's the guy in the bottom right-hand corner of that last slide?
Okay, so that's Popcorn Sutton.
That's Popcorn Sutton?
That's Popcorn, a famous moonshiner. And I thought you guys, he might be pretty angry with me with this little plot here on methanol. And he has been quoted many times saying you throw out the methanol in the 4 shots. Well, you don't. And so I wanted to show you,
Popcorn.
That's right, Popcorn. He's passed away now, so he's not going to get me. But I did want to kind of show you that I wanted to compare our pot still, which is this bottom line here. And what we did is I told you we took the jars 3 through 6 and combined them and analyzed for these chemicals. And then what we did is that we had a sample of White Dog from Buffalo Trace, White Dog Mash Bill number 1. You can buy it at the liquor store. And then with one of the groups that we took down to Moonshine University back in 2019, we used the combination still, which is a picture from Moonshine U right there in the middle. And what we did is we compared the concentrations of these chemicals called congeners with these different stills. And you can see we're right in the ballpark with these expensive stills. So we did as good of a job separating these compounds away with this $90 still as can be done with multi-million-dollar stills that's used at big distilleries. So this has been a fun project. This one also is going to allow us to be able to test different yeast strains and see if we can run up the concentrations of specific chemicals that we want in our flavor profile.
Very cool.
Yeah.
A $90 still. It's amazing.
$90 still.
If you had it, because you know it won't scale as well as a commercial still. So if you had it running nonstop for a week, could you even get 4 gallons out of it? How many gallons of?
No, we have a 5-gallon still, and my liquor license allows us to do 10 gallons. So if we ran all week and just had them back to back to back, because to run the still only takes about 2.5 hours. So if we had maybe 20 fermentations going on at the same time, we could get 4 or 5 gallons in a week easy. Well, not easily. I could get it easily. My grad student could not get it easily. So.
And as a reminder, Jim Beam boasts that they are actually will even do better. The Heaven Hill Distillery in downtown Louisville, which is the single largest bourbon still actively, pumps out like 1,200 gallons a day. So you got a little catching up to do to team up with the big boys there. That's awesome. That's very cool to see. I got a big kick out of that. Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
Matthew Levinson asked a question too that I thought was worth addressing before we got going tonight. And he said, what is the best? This is what I get all the time. What is the best and upcoming bourbon that in 5 years we wish we'll stock up on before the pricing exploded? Man, oh man, Sweet Khaki Malaki. If only I had a crystal ball and or a time machine, I can answer that question. I can't tell you how many bourbon regrets I have about products that if I knew now what I knew then, I would have bought 5 cases of. It's harder than it used to be too, because you've got brands out there that are starting up and they already know what they have. And so they're putting out bottles that are really great, but already at $110, $120. So it's harder to buy a lot, and they probably won't go higher than that price or harder to find. I would say instead, taste what you like. And if you like it and you're afraid it's going to go away, get a number of bottles of those. But if I even knew 12 years ago what I knew about brands like Bland's Eagle Rare, Elijah Craig when it had the 12-year age statement on them, Elmer T. Lee, Bardstown Bourbon Company we're about to talk about, again, their first Origin release or their first Fusion and Discovery releases. I do not have an answer about what we'll want to have now that we will regret not getting 5 years from now. And I don't think anyone does. If anyone tells you that they know exactly what you should pick up now, that's going to be something you'll be proud to have stocked up on 5 years from now, they're either trying to sell you something or they're just spitballing. It's a really hard thing to say, and much harder than it was 10 years ago when you had some secret gems that no one else knew about. Those exist far less. So
yeah,
I will say,
early 1990s, liquor store owner would have helped you carry a case of Blanton's out to your car.
Yeah, delighted he got rid of it. Off
Yeah.
the shelf. I will say there's distilleries to watch. Keep an eye on New Riff and the products they put out. That's tremendous stuff. That's not too far for most of my Ohio friends. Down there in Sparta, halfway between Louisville and Cincinnati, is the Neely family distillery. Their product is just coming of age. Soon they'll have a flagship brand that's aged every bit of probably 5 years or so. Keep an eye on them, but I don't have a specific bottle for you. Anyone who says they do probably doesn't. All right, moving on to our third and final pour for the night. What another beautiful bottle. This is from the Bardstown Bourbon Company. This is their Origin Series. The full name on this one is Origin Series Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. And this is a label that's got some tales to tell. And I'm all about transparency and sharing information. And we'll get into that in just a bit. This is distilled and aged and bottled down in Bardstown, Kentucky by the Bardstown Bourbon Company. It is aged 6 years. We have the mash bill, talking about transparency, right here on the label. So I can tell you, unlike the others, exactly what goes into this bottle. Jim Beam doesn't share their mash bill, and I don't have it for Green River. I don't know if they make it public, but this one right here is 68% corn. My eyes aren't quite as good as they used to be when the small label just keeps getting smaller. 36% rye and 4% malted barley. I think those numbers add up if my eyes are right. But anyway, it's a rye heavy bourbon is the main point of it. And it's 96 proof. So we went from 90 proof to 90 proof to 90-60 proof, all under that 50% alcohol, which are designed to be smooth sippers. I'm back to the Glencairn glass, and I hope you guys are pouring and enjoying this evening as much as I am. And we're going to raise a glass to, if my math is right, and Mark, you can check me, 216 years of Miami University.
Excellent. Good work, Phil.
Ooh. My pre-calc professor will be proud. Holy hand grenade to 216 years at Miami University. Cheers, my friends.
Cheers.
Look at the color on this one. Darker too, right? Oh, this is going to be my favorite of the night. Very mature, very robust. A lot of corn forward notes in those grains. I get some baking spices like cloves and allspice. What do you guys think of this one?
Incredible.
It's also got a very smooth finish. You get kind of those tannins and caramels that coat the finish.
That's really good. I get caramel flavor. This one tastes sweeter to me.
Okay. I will say it's worth noting that for people who bought all these bottles, all three bottles will note this was the most expensive bottle offering of them. This is around the $50 range. So you pay a little bit of a premium for it, but it's a brand new expression from a company that's been distilling for a while. What makes this unique, and we'll get into this more in a minute, is they've started using the Origin series because beforehand, the bourbons they were putting out were a mix of some of their own distillate and products or age and wonderful stuff they had sourced, 14, 12, even 18-year whiskey from other places. But the Origin series is 100% Bardstown Bourbon Company. And they did what I think is one of the hardest things to do in the world of whiskey. They waited. They put the barrels, they distilled, they put them in the warehouses, and they said, not until they're ready for prime time, and we think it's good enough to pass muster, are we going to bottle it. And that's what they've done with their Origin series. They also have a date on the Origin series. They talked about how they're big on transparency. This was distilled in the fall of 2017, probably bottled, in 2023 or so to make it a 6-year bourbon, or dumped from the barrel at least. And it tells their story on the side. The Bardstown Bourbon Company was kind of the first major new startup distillery that came to bourbon country. They went all out. It's a beautiful facility. Highly recommend visiting. They've done some very unique things, including having some glass transparent windows on the edge of their warehouses where you can see the barrels. They have a world-class restaurant, which at the time was unheard of, not unheard of, but not many distilleries were embracing the eat at a distillery concept. They have a room full of vintage bourbon and a long menu, so you can taste just about everything. And I want to talk about age for a second, because as we've talked about before, there's no minimum age that you have to age a bourbon in a bourbon barrel in order for it to meet that criteria of bourbon whiskey. But there are some landmarks. 2 years for Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, or straight bourbon whiskey if not made in Kentucky. And then 4 years is generally where the market quality begins, where you don't have to put how long it was aged on there. almost as a warning to consumers. So like a 6-year bourbon as a first pass for a distillery's offering is good. We've come a long way. The wrong way, although we're getting there. This is a product from Kentucky Deluxe. This was a Heaven Hill product from years ago. Not opened this one yet either. Again, maybe Derby time. From Heaven Hill, pre-fire, which means this was distilled, aged, and bottled before the distillery burned down in 1996. But a few interesting things about this. This was an everyday bottle. Probably at the time $22, the equivalent of maybe $40 today. Then 12 years. No big deal. It's just 12. We got plenty of bourbons aged 12 years. We're not even bragging about it. We're just putting it on there so you know it's 12 years. And now we're excited when someone puts out a 6 or 7 or 8 because we're trying to get those inventories up. We're trying to see more of the 10-year, 11-year, 12 years. But when we had a glut of bourbon in the early 90s when no one was drinking it, 12 years was commonplace. Two interesting things also about this bottle before we get to Bardstown Bourbon Company. Sour mash. We love saying sour mash on whiskey. It doesn't mean a whole lot. Almost everyone uses the sour mash process in distilling instead of using sweet mash. I often say that putting sour mash on your bottle of bourbon is like putting caffeinated on a can of Coca-Cola. It's pretty redundant to the system. Most people know this. And check this out. Charcoal filtered. Who do we associate that with? Usually Tennessee whiskeys and Jack Daniels, but they were doing some of it in Bardstown, Kentucky all those years ago too. All right, sorry. My props sometimes slow me down as I got to put this back in this box. And it came in a box, because why not?
Yeah.
You got to move the whiskey.
Hey, Phil, so I totally agree with you. The Bardstown Distillery is a great place to visit. And one of my favorite tours there is the Barrel Thief tour. Mm-hmm. You actually get to go in that one of those glass face rick houses, and you actually take a thief and pull it out 120 or higher proof and sip it right in a Glencairn glass. Right
Unfiltered.
Wow.
Barrel strength, cask strength, make a little mess. Yeah. It's hard. It's hard to take the whiskey thief and get it into a glass. Talk about bourbon on the floor. You got to have an understanding distillery that does that. Another thing that makes this unique is Bardstown Bourbon Company has a secret weapon. When they started out, they were determined to hire some of the best in the industry. And their master distiller is a gentleman named Steve Nally. Steve Nally is in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. He's worked quite a few places, including Maker's Mark. Not only did he work there 4 years, it's been 4 years and years. It's been years since he's worked there. He's really been around the way. And he lends an expertise and just a wealth of knowledge that very few distillers have who are starting up as new brands. I did an event where a lot of distilleries brought some of their finest offerings, and he brought some whiskey that he had mingled together from existing stock, and it was one of the best things I had all year. I'm hesitant to talk about it because it's not something that one can buy, but it just showed the level of his expertise. When Bardstown started out, again, they had the Fusion series and the Discover series. They were different price points. They had different lines, number 1 through number 8, and then this is the beginning of a new chapter where it's all things they're making. If you've not already, keep your eye on Bardstown Bourbon Company. They've made a big impact, and they're only getting bigger with their distribution, their lineup, and generally their thumbprint on the Kentucky bourbon industry. Now, I promised you opinion sombrero, and then all things are equal here. So this one comes with a bit of an asterisk. There's something you should know, and that's that Green River Distilling Company and Bardstown Bourbon Company are actually now have the same parent company. And the line between the two products in their marketing is starting to blur. There's a tasting room for Bardstown Bourbon Company, and right next to it is the Green River products. Now, that doesn't impact what we drank tonight because the merger just happened in June of 2022. And since all these products are at least 4 years, that means they were distilled, aged, and basically bottled before they came together. But BBC, who's looking to expand their production, continue to help people source. That's a big part of their business, is helping people source their own whiskey. They brought, for an undisclosed sum, they bought the Green River Distillery back in June of 2022. I don't know how much it is, but I believe it was for several truckloads of money because that's what seems all the transaction seems to go for. And then on top of that, the original owners of the Bardstown Bourbon Company, it gets a little murky, but I don't think they're much involved anymore. Bardstown Bourbon Company for the last 3 or 4 years has been owned by Pritzker Private Capital. And to go up the ladder, it all connects. Pritzker Capital is run by Tony Pritzker, who is an heir to the Hyatt Hotels, fortune and empire, and his brother is the governor of Illinois. So there's some big names and some big money coming into bourbon. And I'm not sure how much of that they'll tell you on the Bourbon Trail tours between homespun tales of moonshining in the woods and Uncle, recipe found in a dresser drawer in Prohibition. But both Bardstown Bourbon Company and Green River are owned by some pretty heavyweight investors and conglomerates, and they have a plan, and that's to make amazing whiskey and make a big impact on the bourbon trail. But it's kind of important to know, I think, sometimes, like, who's behind all this, because there's when you scale up, and this is, shatter a bourbon myth right here. If you scale up distilleries, there's very few family-owned distilleries that are on that large scale. Heaven Hill is still owned by the Shapiro family, completely family-run. You could make the argument that Brown-Forman is family-owned because you've got two classes of stock, and the shares that allow you to vote and make decisions for the company are largely owned by the family. So the family still has a controlling share. But, talk about Campari, Sazerac, Centauri, all those companies, there's very few, like, large distilleries that are truly family-owned or family-founded at this point, which I think is fascinating. But don't let that judge or change your opinion about the quality of the bourbon. You like what you like. All right. One more taste of this, and then we'll see if there's questions, and then we'll get you wrapping up so you can get on to, what do people do on Monday evenings? Football's over. I don't know. Rewatch the Saturday Night Live special from last night? I don't know. We have some questions here.
Yeah. This one.
By the way, before we get to questions, I want to raise a glass to everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and joining us. There is few things I enjoy more than sipping whiskey and talking about it with friends new and old. So this is truly a pleasure of mine. So thank you guys for making the time and joining us with us tonight. Okay, Mark, sorry, question.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I had to fill up my glass anyway. You can't take
right? It's like the back and forth because it's time to actually sip.
All right, so going back to Jim Beam, this was a question that came from David. He asked, are all Jim Beam products the same mash bill?
They are not. And you have people who spend a lot of time and have more time than I do to sip, compare, maybe even do some tests and see if they can uncover what mash bill is behind Old Grandad or Basil Hayden or Knob Creek or Booker's, all Jim Beam mash bills. Not even talking about their rye recipe. It's unlikely it's all the same mash bill. But they kind of keep that close to the chest. You always kind of get different answers if you ask at the distillery and who there. But I do not believe that Jim Beam uses the same mash bill for all their products.
So Four Roses sort of does. They've got their 10 or whatever.
10 recipes. That's what makes Four Roses unique.
Okay.
I gave a bottle of 3. I gave 3 bottles of Four Roses to my wife for Valentine's Day. She said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a dozen roses." She said, "How does the couch sound?" I said, "Let's go out to a fancy dinner." And none of that happened. My wife's lovely. None of that happened.
So this next question came from Mark, not me. How well will the Green River hold up in a cocktail like a Manhattan? Will it get lost in a cocktail?
It will very well. You often hear about wheated recipe bourbons doing better in cocktails. Bartenders' friends over the recent years have become rye whiskeys like Bullet Rye, and sometimes wheated recipes like Larceny or even Rebel 100. So it will hold up very well and complement it as long as you're not adding 7 parts bourbon into as long as you're mixing in the recipes right, it'll do very well.
Gotcha.
I always talk about that when you make a cocktail, you don't need to use a very expensive bourbon because some of the nuanced flavors, the stuff that really kind of hits the subtle notes or something that's really smooth, is going to get lost in the cocktail. And you also don't want to do something really high proof. Leave the Bookers behind, leave the cask strength behind. Stuff like that will overpower the recipe and make it hard. So something like a 90 proof Green River wheated, chef's kiss.
Cool. Good. So this is a question from one of our alumni out in California. Been active Gil Kessler. He asks, what is your opinion of old limestone mixing water? I don't even know what that means.
Mike, what do you say to this?
I've never had old limestone mixing water.
I believe it is a product that was put out specifically to be used with mixing bourbon or made for cocktails. I believe it is bottled in Kentucky and uses limestone filtered water. I would say that if your own city municipal tap water is garbage, then it's worth doing. But otherwise, it's kind of like buying Kentucky ice. It's probably not all that necessary. But to go back to what we said, you like what you like. And if you think that using that makes a better product, then cheers to you. But you're not going to see me do backflips on saying you've discovered the Shangri-La of perfect cocktail making.
Gotcha.
These are great questions. We always get such great questions from you know what it is? It's the public ivy. That's why.
That's exactly right. Rob, his class of 72, he asks, how do you become an executive bourbon steward?
Yeah.
Yes. So basically, you go to Moonshine University's website.
A real place.
It's an awesome place, and you can you need to become a bourbon steward first before you become an executive bourbon steward. To become a bourbon steward, you need to read a book and take a test, and if you pass the test, you become a bourbon steward. And then when I actually became an executive bourbon steward, and probably when Phil did, we got to go to Moonshine University for an entire day where we learned a lot about bourbons and some other distilled spirits. We tasted, I don't know how many bourbons, but I ended up having to stay at the Brown Hotel that night.
A long day.
It's a long day. And then you have to take, I think it's a 50-question exam at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's tremendous. It's one of the best days
all
of
the
bourbon.
bourbon?
Yes, after you've sipped all that bourbon all day. And so it's a testament to perseverance and grit too.
I learned more in that one day than I have in months in other endeavors. The Executive Bourbon Steward program is phenomenal.
It is.
Well,
It's not cheap. It's not cheap, but it's great.
And Moonshine University, has got that connection with Miami.
Well, Miami, of course.
Labor
Man, yeah.
So actually, kind of going off that, there's someone just asked, Ron asked, can either of you speak to any Miami alumni currently making significant contributions to the bourbon industry?
Phil Kollin and Mike Crowder.
If you look up the list of 10,000 bourbon influencers, I'm number 10,001.
Hey.
Really it's I always feel like I meet, because down here in Louisville, Kentucky, there's a fair amount of people who connected or went to Miami University, and I often feel like I meet people and then I completely forgot that they went to Miami University. So I wish I had a better answer, but I need to keep the Rolodex updated with the people I've met along the way who have a connection to Miami, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. Sorry.
No, that's right.
Well, so one of our students that took our fermentation class and went to Moonshine University in 2017 or 18 developed the peach series for Jim Beam.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, she did. She worked with Dave for a while at Flavor Man, and then went and worked with Jim Beam to do the peach series.
That's cool. Okay, back to Jim Beam. Good way to transition there. What makes Jim Beam's Devil's Cut different?
I used to get that question all the time. I've gotten in lessons, they've taken their foot off the advertising campaign and the gas, but the ads are a little deceptive because it made it look like the whiskey went in the barrels and they'd have a complicated machine that would twist it like they were pieces of bungee cord and soak the whiskey out. Angel's share had always been a term in distilling. Devil's Cut was a relatively new term, and what they did was genius. They realized that in the course of aging 4-year Jim Beam, several gallons were left trapped in the wood. So they created a proprietary process that involved getting the whiskey out of the wood. It actually goes back to something distillers had done for years called sweating a barrel. And in fact, warehouse workers were known to take empty barrels home, sweat out the whiskey, put it in their backyard, and then have barrel strength bourbon that was trapped in the wood. So Jim Beam took this to the next level, got the bourbon out of the wood, but then they also mixed it with some other bourbon they had to get it to that proof point and flavor, and made a good job of kind of salvaging the barrels. It really did create a unique flavor profile. It wasn't, I think, as huge a hit, at least review-wise and critical-wise, as they were hoping, but they found a way to extract whiskey that was trapped in the staves from that aging process and turning into a new product. Mike, you probably have something more to say on that.
Well, Fred No was given credit for coming up with that procedure, and it looked like, and again, with a lot of bourbon stories, not all of them are true, but they are great stories. And what I was told one time when I asked that was that they would empty a barrel out and only add a couple of gallons of water back, and then shake it and do other things, not for very long, and then pour that out. And then, just as Phil said, you have to have a great blender that will come back and take that remaining liquid and make sure it's good quality for a Jim Beam product.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to drink only what came out of the barrel staves. You're going to want to mingle it with other products they have.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they created a whole new thing with Devil's Cut, and no one had done that before. And they put Mila Kunis in some ads and put some imagery, and it made a big impact for a while.
Sure.
Sometimes Jim Beam releases products, they make a hoopla and it disappears. They put out like a Prohibition bottle, and I think that's all but gone. So when you have that much inventory and that much staff, you can sometimes throw something to the wall, and if it doesn't stick, kind of take your foot away from it, and no one notices.
Gotcha. All right, so this is from Kim, class of 77. She wants to know, what do you think about the trend of investing in barrels via casks, and others?
You know, that's a big thing. You see a lot of it on social media. I've gotten some calls about that. It's the idea that these companies have whiskey that they didn't produce, but they have the warehouse space, and you can own it and store it as long as you want. And then when it's ready for prime time, you can bottle it. It's expensive, and I don't know what I would do with that much bourbon. I think if you have a purpose and a plan, it might be worth your time, and you do research on the company. But you know, I like my bourbon ready to drink. I like having it in a bottle ready to go. So there's quite a few of them out there, and they're creating and building giant warehouses that they're storing this bourbon in for their clients. But I haven't dabbled too much in it because personally it doesn't do, if I were to buy a bourbon that they had to sell me that was a 2-year age bourbon that's going to be mostly filled for that much money, and they say, we'll maintain it for you, and then in 5 years we'll help you bottle it, I barely know what I'm having for lunch tomorrow, much less what I would do with a full barrel's worth of bourbon in 5 years. But it may be the right opportunity for you. Gotcha. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, with the Angel share and with the case, was it 1792? One of their rick houses kind of collapsed, and didn't one
not kind of.
Yeah, and the one at Jack, was there one at Jack Brown?
Just last week, down at Jack Daniels, a quarter of the warehouse collapsed in one of their 1960 warehouses. Yeah,
Nice.
Yeah.
No one was injured, and it was very little inventory. It was a minor warehouse collapse.
Yeah, my luck, the barrel that I bought would be the one that collapsed the rick house. So I'm kind of like Phil. I like this stuff already on the shelf that I can go home and crack it open and have a sip. So
yeah, well, you can sort of dabble in it with the whole ambassador thing with Maker's Mark, where you get your name on a barrel,
and then you get certified people who know what they're doing. You're guaranteed to get pretty good stuff. There's much less roll of the dice on how it's going to turn out. Yeah,
which is what I did, and it was cool because I got a special tour and my name's on a couple bottles. It's cool.
I think we've mentioned this every time, but it's worth doing again. Maker's Mark Ambassador Program is tremendous. It's completely free to join. Yeah. You get your name on a barrel. You get a golden ticket when it's ready, and you can go buy as many bottles as you want that includes at least part of the whiskey from your barrel. But most importantly, it's completely free. They send you holiday gifts every year, special things. Become a Maker's Mark Ambassador.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Again, Bourbon Switzerland. I don't really care what you do with your time, but it's a great program.
All right, just a couple more here to wrap up, and they're both from Murph. So first one, does holding a bottle and aging it yourself before opening it make it any better? Does it do anything at all?
Oh, Murph. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. I'll tell you a great story. Jimmy Russell is at Wild Turkey. He's the Bourbon Buddha. He's been there forever and a day. You've got legends, distillers, and he's way on top of it. And a guy showed up once with a bottle of Wild Turkey from 1978. And this was a few years ago. And he said, I got to show you this. I've got a bottle of bourbon here that's like 44 years old. What do you think it's worth? And Jimmy Russell looked at me and he goes, no, you've got a 6-year bourbon in a 44-year bottle. It's worth about $19.50. There are two things you can put bourbon in that'll stop the aging process once it leaves the bourbon barrel: a properly sealed glass bottle and a stainless steel container. Once you have it in the glass bottle, you're probably not going to age it any better. In fact, the only thing you're going to do if you keep it in a really hot temperature or a place where it's exposed to a lot of sunlight is make it go down in quality. So once you have that bottle, it's considered a finished product. It's not like wine. It's done. It's in its best state that you'll have it. But Murph, it's a good question.
But what if the bottle's open? Does that make a difference?
It does. You're on the clock when the bottle opens, depending on how much you've had to drink of it already, because the less bottle quantity and then the more oxidation, the more it'll interact with it. You've got between, depending on who you ask, 2 to 5 years before you start having flavor drift, before it really starts changing how it initially tastes. Now, I'm not going to say it goes bad. It doesn't go bad, but it's not going to taste how the distillery intended in a relatively short time. Mike, what do you say to that with the chemistry?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that because in order for oxygen to react with anything in the bottle, If you just let it sit there, it would take forever for it to react. You have to have a catalyst, and while it's in the barrel, I think there are catalysts in there. I'm not so sure there would need to be something in that bourbon that could catalyze that oxidation reaction. And in the barrel, it's probably copper that comes off of the still during the distillation process.
For me, I can taste if I've got old bottles in the back, I can taste that they don't taste the way they should. So I've got the empirical evidence.
We did do the sunlight experiment though, and since bourbon is colored, it will absorb light.
Yeah.
And even after a week, you can start to see differences in the concentrations of chemicals in it.
Try it this spring. Take a bottle of a bourbon you don't care much or low end, put it on your back patio, and see what it changes in just 2 weeks. It's remarkable.
It is.
All right, what else we got, Mark?
All right, yep, last one here. What temp?
Well, with a good one.
Yeah, it's a Murph. It's a Murph one here.
Yeah.
What temp did the chem department use to age its barrels? And are there companies doing this and selling it at inflated ages?
Well, so we used the oven at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the refrigerator was a normal a commercial refrigerator. So it was somewhere between 38 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know of any distilleries that do this. You would have to have an expensive large oven to roll a 53-gallon barrel in. And then that barrel the barrels are hot they're hot to the touch.
And you also told me that they last far less time because like the wood decomposes faster too.
It will.
I saw you last year.
Yeah, it will.
So this isn't something that scales very well.
No, this would be those very hard to find bottles. And
then Murph, to answer the second part of your question, you got to watch while it's on a label. We talked about transparency and facts, but there's a whole lot of malarkey, whole lot of just utter crap on a label. And when you have that age statement on there, that's a legal binding statement. So they can talk about an inflated age, but they can't claim to be any older than it is. There is a distillery that'll remain nameless that was in North Carolina that had a rapid aging product, and for a brief time on their label they said tastes like a 10-year aged bourbon ingest, and at the bottom it would say aged 2 years, and that landed with a flop. No one wanted something that said 2 years but claimed, because it was fine to say this tastes like a 10-year bourbon, then they put how long it was actually aged in their legal statement. That didn't go over so well. That was a flop.
I bet not. All right.
I have one more thing to share. I'm always encouraging people to enjoy their whiskey in pairings with food and sweet treats and chocolates. So for Valentine's Day, I ended up with some of these delicious salted caramel hearts. So I am tasting this with my whiskey. From stroop waffles to bourbon balls to charcuterie boards, always try to pair your whiskey with something new, and you'll discover new flavor combinations. And for tonight, for me, it's chocolate.
Excellent. Well, I just have one more comment here from Rob72. He said, excellent tasting, very informative. Thank you very much. So
Thank you,
Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'd just like to say thank you to you, Phil, and to you, Mike, for leading this webinar today and sharing so much bourbon knowledge with us. I love this webinar every year. I hope we keep doing it, and I hope I get keeping able to host it, because I do love it. So, and also, again, big thanks to the Knowles of Oxford for their sponsorship of not only this webinar, but all of our Winter College webinars. And as a reminder, this is our last Winter College 2025 webinar, but they've all been recorded. So if you missed one, no big deal. You can find them. This one's recorded as well, so you'll be able to go back and watch them at any time. And you can do that by visiting our webinar page at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. And you can go there to revisit the past webinars and to see the upcoming webinars. So thank you again, everyone out there, for joining us this evening. Happy Charter Day to all of those Miami doctors. And as always, love and honor. Thanks again.
Love and honor,
everyone.
guys.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, everyone.